The folder landed on the white tablecloth between us with a soft slap. My husband rested one hand on it and looked at me across the candlelit table as if he were presenting a quarterly report to his board. "I want a prenup," Daniel said. "I'm not risking my future for her." He didn't say my name. He said her. That was the moment I understood something about the man sitting across from me that I hadn't wanted to admit. I picked up my wine glass, took a small sip, and set it back down. Then I smiled. Smart decision. Daniel blinked. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely surprised. We were sitting in a private dining room at a restaurant near the Chicago River, the kind of place where the waiters quietly removed your plate before you realized you were finished. Outside taxis moved along the wet pavement, and the windows reflected the warm lights from the buildings across the street. Daniel was 58, 6 feet tall, silver at the temples, and very comfortable in a suit. He was the CEO of Whitmore Industrial Solutions, a manufacturing company headquartered in Naperville. He liked numbers, revenue, margins, acquisitions, stock prices. He could spend 20 minutes explaining why a company had a good quarter and another 20 explaining why everyone else had misunderstood it. Tonight he had brought paperwork. "I thought you'd be upset," he said. "Why? Most women would be." I almost laughed. Instead, I folded my hands on the table. "Well, I'm not most women." He smiled, apparently relieved. "No, you're not." I watched him open the folder. Daniel had never been a cruel man in the obvious sense. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He wasn't the kind of husband who made scenes in restaurants. His weakness was quieter. He believed his success made him the smartest person in almost every room. And because I had allowed him to believe I was less financially sophisticated than he was, he had never questioned that assumption. We had been married for 3 years. He had met me when I was 52 after my first marriage had ended, and I had spent years rebuilding my own life. Daniel had told me he admired that I was independent. At least that's what he said. He knew I had worked in finance. He knew I owned my home before we married. He knew I had investments. But whenever the subject came up, he treated my finances like something pleasantly modest. "You've done well," he'd say, the same tone a person might use when complimenting someone on a well-kept garden. He never asked how well. Daniel's attorney, Robert Hayes, had prepared the agreement. Robert was a polished Chicago lawyer in his early 60s with a calm voice and the habit of removing his glasses whenever he wanted someone to pay attention. He wasn't at dinner that night, but Daniel had clearly studied the document carefully. "This protects everything I brought into the marriage," Daniel explained. "The company, my stock, future business interests, investment accounts, everything. I see, and obviously anything you brought in remains yours." "That's fair." Daniel leaned back. "I'm glad you understand." I looked at him. I understand perfectly. What I didn't tell him was that I had already called my attorney before coming to dinner. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She had represented me for more than a decade and had the rare ability to make complicated legal matters sound like a grocery list. 2 days earlier, I had told her Daniel wanted a prenup. She hadn't gasped. She hadn't judged him. She had simply asked, "What does he think you own?" I had laughed. "Not much." Margaret had paused. Then she said, "Rebecca, are you sure you want to let him keep thinking that I remember sitting at my kitchen island that morning looking at the coffee I'd forgotten to drink?" Yes, I had said, at least for now. Back at the restaurant, Daniel closed the folder. "I want us to have separate property. It's cleaner." "Fine. And I don't want any misunderstandings later." "Neither do I." He smiled again. "This is why I knew I could talk to you." That sentence bothered me more than it should have. Not because of the prenup, because he sounded proud of himself, as though he had just demonstrated unusual maturity. I picked up my purse. "Then let's do it properly." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean I want my own attorney to draft an agreement too?" He stared at me for half a second. Then he laughed. "Of course. I'll have her make sure everything I brought into this marriage is protected. Absolutely." He waved one hand. "That seems fair." I nodded. Good. The rest of dinner was surprisingly pleasant. We talked about a charity golf tournament Daniel was attending the following weekend. He complained about a supplier who had missed a deadline. I told him my neighbor's golden retriever had somehow learned to open the gate between our yards. For a while, we sounded like an ordinary married couple. That's the strange thing about moments that change your life. They don't always feel important while they're happening. Sometimes you finish your steak, pay the bill, drive home, brush your teeth, and go to bed beside the person who just revealed something you can never unknow. The next morning I called Margaret. "I want the agreement started," I said. "Already, yes. And I want everything protected." There was a pause. Everything, yes. Margaret knew what that meant. She had seen the documents years ago. She knew about Lawson Capital Partners. She knew about the commercial properties in Illinois and Wisconsin. She knew about the private manufacturing investments. She knew about the accounts Daniel had never seen because I had never given him a reason to see them. Most importantly, she knew something Daniel didn't. My financial life wasn't remotely close to what he imagined. "I'll start today," Margaret said. "Thank you." I hung up and sat quietly at my desk. For the first time, I wondered whether I had made a mistake by keeping so much of my financial life private, not legally, emotionally. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition, but Daniel had turned it into one the moment he told me he wouldn't risk his future for me. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his company. And I certainly didn't want revenge simply for the sake of hurting him. What I wanted was something much simpler. I wanted the same protection he believed he deserved. And I was about to find out what happened when a man who thought he knew his wife's financial life finally saw the numbers. 3 days after that dinner, Daniel came home from the office carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression he usually had after closing a deal. He set the briefcase beside the kitchen island. "Robert says everything is moving along." I was standing at the counter slicing an apple. "That's good. He thinks we can have the agreement finalized within a couple of weeks." I nodded. Daniel opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water. "You know, he said I was worried you'd take this personally." "I didn't, I can tell," he smiled. I put another slice of apple on my plate. There was something almost funny about the way he was behaving. He had spent years negotiating million-dollar contracts, yet he seemed especially proud of successfully negotiating a document with his own wife. "What did Robert say?" I asked. "He said you're being reasonable." I looked up. "I'm glad." Daniel twisted the cap off his bottle. "He also said the important thing is keeping our premarital assets clearly separated. That makes sense. And honestly, Rebecca, that's how successful marriages work." I waited. He seemed to expect me to ask what he meant. Instead, I took my plate and sat down. Daniel continued. "People get careless when they mix everything together. Then years later, one person ends up claiming things they didn't build." There it was. I didn't respond. He didn't notice. That was becoming a pattern. A week later, we attended a charity luncheon in Oak Brook. Daniel was being honored for supporting a local workforce training program, and I went because that was what wives did at these events. We sat at a round table with several executives and their spouses. Someone asked Daniel about his company. He became animated immediately. He talked about expansion, new contracts, and a possible acquisition. Then one of the men across from us turned to me. "So, Rebecca, do you work?" Daniel answered before I could. "She manages a few investments. A few." I smiled politely. The man nodded. "Nice." Then the conversation moved on. Daniel didn't even realize what he had done. On the drive home, I looked out the passenger window at the strip malls and gas stations passing along Route 83. "Why did you answer for me?" Daniel glanced over. "What? At lunch." "Oh." He shrugged. "I was just answering. I noticed." He kept his eyes on the road. "You don't like talking about money. That isn't the same thing." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know." And I did. That was part of the problem. He rarely meant anything by it. He simply assumed. That night after Daniel went upstairs, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. I pulled up the reports Margaret had sent me. Lawson Capital Partners wasn't a flashy operation. There was no giant office with my name on the door, no magazine profile, no television interviews. It had started 25 years earlier with a small investment I made alongside 2 former colleagues. At the time, I was working as a financial analyst in Chicago. We found a struggling manufacturing company that had good people, useful equipment, and terrible management. Everyone else saw a dying business. We saw an opportunity. We invested. Then we worked. There were no overnight fortunes. There were years of long meetings, refinancing, tax filings, difficult negotiations, and weekends spent reading financial statements while everyone else was watching football. Eventually, the company recovered. We sold our position. Then we did it again, and again. Over the years, I became increasingly careful about publicity. I didn't need people knowing what I owned. I liked being able to walk into a coffee shop without someone recognizing me. My holdings eventually included commercial properties in Illinois and Wisconsin, several private companies, diversified investments, and substantial interests in manufacturing businesses. My net worth had grown to approximately $82 million. Daniel's was around $8 million, 10 times. The number looked strange on the screen, not because it was impressive, because it was so completely irrelevant to the marriage I thought we'd built. I closed the laptop. For a moment, I wondered whether I should simply tell him everything. Then I remembered his words at dinner. I'm not risking my future for her. I wasn't angry anymore. I was disappointed. There was a difference. The following Friday, Daniel invited several friends to the country club. I didn't go. I had a headache and told him I wanted a quiet evening. Later that night, while I was reading in bed, he came upstairs laughing. What I asked? He took off his watch. Tom was asking about the prenup. I closed my book. What did you tell him? That everything's fine? He smiled. Rebecca finally understands that marriage isn't a retirement plan. I stared at him. He laughed. I'm kidding, sure. He didn't notice the change in my voice. A few days later, Margaret called. We've reviewed Robert's draft, and there are a few things I don't like. I sat straighter, such as the language concerning business interests acquired during the marriage. It's broad. How broad? Broad enough that I want to protect you from future disputes. I rubbed my forehead. Then do it. I will. She paused. Rebecca, are you certain you want to proceed this way? I knew what she meant. Yes. Even knowing what this might do to the marriage, I looked through the kitchen window. Daniel was outside, standing beside the grill, talking on his phone. I don't know what it will do to the marriage, I said. But I know what it already tells me. Margaret didn't push. That was one reason I trusted her. The next afternoon, Daniel handed me his financial spreadsheet. Robert put this together, he said proudly. Okay, it shows everything clearly. I looked at it. The numbers were neat. The formatting was professional. The calculations were wrong. I checked one total twice. Then I checked another. Daniel watched me. What, you have a mistake here? He leaned over, where I pointed. He frowned. You're right. I handed him the pen. There's another one. He stared at the second figure. Then he laughed. Apparently, I'm not as good with spreadsheets as I thought. I smiled. Apparently. He kissed the top of my head and walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Then I looked back at the spreadsheet. Daniel thought he had shown me the full picture. He hadn't. Not even close. And neither of us knew yet that the next version of the financial disclosure would change the entire tone of this marriage. The call from Daniel's attorney came on a Tuesday morning at 9:17. I remember the exact time because I was standing in my kitchen waiting for the coffee maker to finish. Mrs. Whitmore, yes. This is Robert Hayes. His voice sounded different from the last time we'd spoken. Not formal. Careful. Good morning, Robert. Do you have a few minutes? I looked at the coffee maker. I do. There was a pause. I've reviewed the financial disclosures your attorney provided. I leaned against the counter, and another pause. Are these figures accurate? I almost smiled. Yes. Robert exhaled slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Does Lawson Capital Partners belong to you? Yes. All of it. No, not all of it. How much? I told him. Silence. Then he asked about the commercial properties. I answered. He asked about several private manufacturing investments. I answered those too. Finally, he said, and the investment accounts listed in Schedule C. Those are mine. I see. I could hear papers moving on his desk. Robert was a good lawyer, he didn't panic easily, but I could tell he was recalculating everything in his head. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I don't think your husband understands the extent of your assets. I don't think he does either. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? Because nobody asked." He was quiet again. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I think we need to slow this down." I frowned. "Why?" "Because the prenup your husband requested was drafted around the assumption that his financial position is substantially stronger than yours." I looked toward the kitchen window. "That's not my problem." "No," he said carefully, "but it could become a legal problem if the agreement isn't structured correctly." I understood. The agreement had been designed to protect Daniel from a wife he believed had modest assets. Now his lawyer had discovered that the wife sitting across from him at dinner had built a financial life worth roughly $82 million. Daniel's estimated net worth was around $8 million, 10 times less. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. "Robert," I said, "I don't want anything that belongs to Daniel. I understand. I don't want his company. I understand. I don't want half of anything. I understand. I want exactly what he asked for, separate property, clear boundaries, no confusion." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wish every client explained it that clearly." I laughed. It was the first time either of us had laughed during the call. Before we hung up, he said, "He needs to know." "I know. Will you tell him I looked toward the staircase?" "Not yet." That afternoon, Margaret came to my house. She arrived with a thick folder and stopped in the doorway. "You got the call?" "I did." She smiled. "I knew he would." We sat at the dining room table. Margaret opened the folder. "The numbers are all there. Property records, ownership documents, investment statements, corporate interests. Everything is properly documented." I nodded. "Good." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Are you okay?" I thought about it. "No." That answer surprised even me. Margaret closed the folder. "Because of Daniel, yes." I stared at the table. "I keep thinking about that dinner. You're allowed to. He said he wasn't risking his future for me." Margaret didn't respond. I continued, "I know he didn't know the numbers. But that's not what bothers me. What does I thought he knew me?" The room went quiet. I had spent 3 years believing that Daniel loved my independence. Now I wondered whether he simply liked the version of independence that didn't challenge him. That evening, Daniel came home early. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his tie, and dropped his briefcase beside the counter. "You look serious," I said. Robert called. My stomach tightened. Oh, he wants to postpone the signing. I put down the dish towel. "Did he say why?" He said there are some issues with the financial disclosures. I waited. Daniel stared at me. "Rebecca, did you leave something out?" "No. Are you sure?" "Yes." He rubbed his forehead. "This is getting ridiculous." I said nothing. "He made it sound like your disclosure was complicated." "It is." How complicated? I looked at him. "Complicated enough." He didn't like that answer. "What does that mean?" "It means your lawyer has questions." Daniel pulled out a chair. "About what I sat across from him." "Ask him." "I am asking you." "And I'm telling you to ask him." His jaw tightened. For the first time since the prenup conversation began, there was real tension between us. Not shouting, not insults. Just two people sitting across from each other and realizing they didn't have the same understanding of their marriage. Daniel stood. "This shouldn't be this difficult." "No," I said quietly. "It shouldn't." He walked away. I stayed at the table for another 10 minutes. That night, I barely slept. At 2:14 in the morning, I walked downstairs for water. Daniel was already there. He was sitting alone in the dark, staring at his phone. He looked up. "Can't sleep, no." "Me neither." I filled a glass. He didn't look at me. Did I do something wrong? The question stopped me. I turned it around. Daniel's voice was softer than usual. "I mean, with the prenup." I didn't answer immediately. "You asked for protection," I said. "Yes." "So that's what you're getting?" He looked at me. "What does that mean?" It means the agreement will protect both of us." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You know, I wasn't trying to insult you. I know. I just wanted to protect what I'd built." I looked at him. So did I. He frowned. "What have you built?" I held his gaze. "More than you think." He waited. I could have told him everything right there. Instead, I picked up my glass. "Good night, Daniel." The next morning, Robert called Margaret. By lunchtime, Margaret called me. "Rebecca," she said, "he knows." I sat down. "Knows what he ran the numbers." My heart started beating faster. "And he calculated your approximate net worth." I closed my eyes. "How did he react?" Margaret gave a short laugh. Apparently, he stopped talking for about 30 seconds. That image almost made me smile. Then she said, his exact words were, "Are you telling me she has 10 times what I have?" I opened my eyes. "Yes," I said quietly. Margaret lowered her voice. "And now his lawyer wants an emergency meeting." I looked out the window at the ordinary street beyond my house. Cars passed. A man walked his dog. Somebody was dragging a trash bin toward the curb. Nothing outside had changed, but inside my marriage, everything had. And I knew the next conversation would be the one Daniel could no longer avoid. The emergency meeting never happened. At least not the way Daniel wanted it to. 2 days after Robert Hayes discovered the numbers, Daniel called me from his office. "We should have dinner Friday." I was standing in the grocery store near the dairy aisle comparing 2 brands of half and half. Dinner with some people from the company. Tom, Susan, Robert, a couple of the board members. I picked up 1 carton and put it back. Why? Daniel hesitated. I think it would be good to clear the air. I knew exactly what he meant. He wanted an audience. Maybe he wanted to prove that nothing had changed. Maybe he wanted to see whether I would admit that the financial disclosures had been exaggerated. Either way, I agreed. Friday is fine. The dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant in Oak Brook. It wasn't flashy, but it was expensive enough that nobody looked at the menu before ordering. There were 8 of us around the table. Daniel sat at the head. I sat beside him. Robert was across from me. He looked uncomfortable before the appetizers even arrived. Daniel seemed completely different. Relaxed, confident. He ordered a bottle of wine, joked with the waiter, and spent the first 20 minutes talking about a new manufacturing contract. I listened. I had learned long ago that people reveal more when they believe nobody is paying attention. Eventually, Daniel raised his glass. "I think it's important for couples to have clear financial boundaries." Susan, one of the board members' wives, smiled politely. "I agree." Daniel looked at me. "Rebecca and I are finalizing our prenup." I smiled. "Yes?" Tom laughed. "That's the fun part of marriage." Everyone gave the kind of polite laugh people give when they don't know whether something is actually funny. Daniel continued. "We've had a few delays because of some unexpected paperwork." Robert cleared his throat. Daniel waved him off. "It'll be fine." I watched Robert's face. He looked like a man trying to stop a train with his hands. Daniel turned to the group. "Rebecca has some investments I wasn't fully aware of." Tom looked at me. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Daniel laughed. "Apparently." There was something strange about the way he said it. Not pride, not admiration, more like disbelief. Then he looked at Robert. "Tell them." Robert didn't move. "Tell them what?" Daniel smiled, "about the numbers." Robert glanced at me. I gave him a small nod. He took off his glasses. "I think it's important that everyone understand this is a private legal matter." Daniel laughed. "We're among friends." Robert looked at him. "Daniel, I don't think that's a good idea." The room became quiet. Daniel's smile faded. Robert placed his glasses on the table. "You asked me to review the financial disclosures?" "Yes, I did." And Robert looked at him for several seconds. "Your wife's disclosure is accurate." Daniel frowned. "I know." "No," Robert said. "I don't think you do." Nobody spoke. Daniel leaned forward. "What are you saying?" Robert opened the folder beside him. "Lawson Capital Partners is not a small investment account." Daniel's face changed. "I know she has investments." Robert continued. "She owns a significant interest in the company." Daniel stared at him. What company? Robert named it. Daniel sat back. That can't be right. It is. Robert turned a page. She also has ownership interests in several other private companies. Daniel shook his head. No, I said nothing. Robert continued. She owns multiple commercial properties. Daniel looked at me. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Rebecca, I didn't answer. Robert finally said the number. Her estimated net worth is approximately $82 million. Nobody moved. A second passed. Then another. Tom, who had been drinking wine, took a sip at exactly the wrong moment and coughed so hard he had to put his glass down. Susan whispered, "Oh my goodness." Daniel stared at Robert. 82. Yes. Million. Yes. Daniel looked at me again. His face had gone pale. And mine? Robert hesitated. Approximately 8 million. Tom looked between us. Then he muttered, "Daniel, you really should have done your homework." That broke the tension for half a second. Someone laughed, then stopped. Daniel didn't. He was staring at me as though I had become a stranger. You knew I looked at him. Yes. You knew I didn't know yes. He pushed his chair back slightly. Why didn't you tell me? I kept my voice calm. You never asked. That isn't the point. It is part of the point. Daniel's voice rose. You let me think I let you believe what you already believed. He stopped. I continued. You assumed my investments were modest. You assumed my house was the biggest thing I owned. You assumed I had some retirement accounts and a few stocks. Daniel shook his head. This is unbelievable. No, I said. What's unbelievable is that you asked me for a prenup because you were afraid I might take something from you. I wasn't afraid of that. Then why did you say you weren't risking your future for me? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I had never seen Daniel speechless before. Robert quietly closed the folder. The agreement can still be completed, he said, but it needs to be completely mutual. Daniel looked at him. What does that mean? It means both of you protect what you brought into the marriage. Daniel looked at me. And you don't want anything from me? No. Not the company? No. Not my investments? No. Nothing. He stared at me. I finally said what I had been holding inside for weeks. You wanted a contract because you thought I was a financial risk. I paused, so I decided to make sure the contract protected me from being treated like one. Daniel looked down at the table. The room had become painfully quiet. For once, nobody was talking about his company. Nobody cared about his quarterly numbers. Nobody was impressed by his title. They were watching him discover something he should have known long before that evening. His wife had built a life, too, and she had done it without needing anyone to applaud. Daniel eventually whispered, I feel like I don't know you. I looked at him. That makes two of us. The dinner ended shortly afterward. There was no dramatic shouting match. No slammed doors, just chairs moving quietly across the floor and people avoiding eye contact as they left. Outside, the evening air was cool. Daniel stood beside the car with his hands in his pockets. I need time, he said. So do I. He nodded. For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't have a clever answer. And somehow that silence felt more honest than anything he'd said all week. For the next 2 weeks, Daniel and I lived in the same house like two people renting rooms from the same landlord. We were polite. We spoke about groceries bills, the dog next door, and whether the plumber was coming Thursday or Friday. But the easy conversations were gone. Every morning I made coffee around 7. Daniel usually came downstairs at 7:30. Morning, that was about it. The silence wasn't cruel. In some ways it was worse. It gave both of us too much time to think. Daniel eventually asked me to meet him at a small coffee shop in Naperville. He arrived before me and was already sitting near the window. When I walked in, he stood. Thanks for coming. I sat down. He looked tired, not physically exhausted, just humbled. I've been thinking, he said. I assumed you were. He gave a small smile. That's fair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said I was wrong. I didn't answer. I judged you based on what I thought I knew. Yes, I shouldn't have. No. He looked down at his coffee. I thought you had some investments, a nice house, retirement savings. I know. I never imagined. He stopped. I waited. You built all of that yourself, yes? How I smiled slightly. Work. He laughed quietly. I suppose that's not the whole story. No, but it's most of it. I told him about my first manufacturing investment, about the meetings that lasted until midnight, about the companies that almost failed, about the years when I reinvested nearly everything instead of spending it. Daniel listened. For once, he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me I looked at him? Would it have changed how you treated me?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. A week later, we met with both attorneys. The new agreement was completely different in tone. It wasn't Daniel's original document with a few changes. It was mutual. My premarital assets remained mine. His remained his. Future income stayed with the person who earned it unless we deliberately agreed otherwise. Neither of us could claim the other's businesses simply because we were married. There was nothing punitive, no tricks, no hidden clauses, just boundaries. Daniel read every page carefully. At one point he looked at me. You really aren't asking for anything, no. Not even if we divorce, no. He nodded slowly. I believe you now. I almost smiled. You should have believed me before. He lowered his eyes. That afternoon Daniel signed. Then I signed. The lawyers exchanged copies. It was strangely anticlimactic. No champagne, no applause, just 2 signatures and a stack of paper. Daniel picked up his copy. I thought this would make me feel better. What does it make you feel? He thought for a moment. Embarrassed, I smiled. At least you're honest. He laughed. That was the first genuine laugh we'd shared in weeks. But signing the agreement didn't magically repair our marriage. That was the part nobody in those dramatic stories ever talked about. A contract could settle property. It couldn't settle disappointment. For several months, Daniel and I went to counseling. Not because our marriage was legally broken, because something more important had cracked. He had to learn how to stop measuring people by visible success. I had to learn that keeping every part of myself private wasn't always the same thing as being independent. We both had work to do. Eventually, Daniel started asking questions. Not about money, about me. He wanted to know what I had been like in my 30s, what I had wanted before we met, why I preferred quiet weekends, why I still kept an old recipe box from my mother. Small things, ordinary things, things he should have known. One Sunday morning, several months later, we stopped at a neighborhood diner. Nothing fancy, just coffee, eggs, toast, and a waitress who had been there so long she knew half the customers by name. Daniel stirred his coffee. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever regret marrying me? I looked at him. Sometimes. He nodded. I appreciated that he didn't defend himself. Do you regret it? He thought for a moment. I regret not knowing you better. That answer stayed with me. Outside the diner window, people were getting into their cars. A father helped his little boy into a booster seat. An older couple walked slowly toward the pharmacy next door. Nobody knew our story. Nobody cared about our net worth. And sitting there, I realized something. The best part of what happened wasn't that I had more money than Daniel. It wasn't watching his lawyer discover the numbers. It wasn't the silence at that dinner. It wasn't even the look on Daniel's face when he realized the woman he thought needed protecting financially had built 10 times more than he had. The real victory was simpler. I stopped letting someone else's assumptions make me feel smaller. Daniel had asked for a prenup because he wanted certainty. In the end, we both got it. But the certainty wasn't about money. It was about knowing exactly what kind of marriage we were willing to build. A few months after we signed the agreement, Daniel came home from work and found me at the kitchen table reviewing an investment report. He put his briefcase down. What are you working on? Nothing exciting. Can I see? I looked up. Are you sure? He smiled. I'm finally curious. I turned the laptop toward him. He studied the page for a moment. Then he laughed. I don't understand half of this. I laughed too. Neither did you before. He shook his head. Fair enough. And that was the moment I knew something had changed. Not because Daniel suddenly admired my bank accounts, because he had finally become interested in the woman sitting across from him. Money had never been the point. Respect was. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your worth, remember this: you don't have to prove yourself with a dramatic victory. Sometimes the strongest response is simply knowing what you've built and refusing to let anyone diminish it. And if this story made you think about the value of trust, respect, and honesty in a marriage, I'd love to hear your thoughts.